Hey, hey,
Good morning. Well,
how
it's
are
morning
you?
for me.
Yeah,
I'm
yeah,
pretty good.
yeah. Where in the States are you?
I'm in Colorado.
Oh, that's right. I know that. I remember reading that in your bio and being very jealous of looking you standing in the mountains and the gorgeous scenery. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, amazing, amazing. Yeah, it's probably nicer there than it is here in overcast Manchester. It's pretty drab here. But yeah, good stuff. How are you doing? You all right?
Yeah, I am a little sleepy, but other than that, I'm good.
Sure. Yeah, I guess it's early for you, right? Is it 8:30 in the morning?
It's 7:30.
7:30. Oh, of course you're on, man. Yeah. Gosh. Wow. Yeah. Well, thank you for getting up so early. I appreciate it. It's a nice change for
Absolutely.
me. Most of the interviews I do with people in America, it's usually me staying up to like 3 in the morning or something. Because a lot of people have like
Oh,
day
geez.
jobs, they're busy doing something, and they're like, I'll get it in after, which is fine. But then you add 5, 8 hours on the end to that, and it's late on my end. So it's nice. It makes a nice change doing it in the daytime for me. Yeah, so I appreciate it. I appreciate your sacrifice of dragging yourself out, bleary eyed, kind of trying to wake up for a podcast. Hopefully, it wakes you up for your day, you know?
Yeah, for sure. I probably can't vouch for anything that I say in the next half an hour until I fully wake up, but
It's a good like get out of jail clause, right? You're like, oh, I was just waking up. It's fine. Don't hold me to that. I have that policy for everything I say anyway. I'm like, what, you think everything I say I think is true or believe? Yeah, absolutely. It's good. Have you got a busy day ahead of you?
Pretty busy. Yeah, just
Yeah.
seeing clients and maybe maybe play volleyball later this evening.
Nice. Okay, cool. Do you play volleyball pretty well, or is it just kind of like a thing you do every now and again?
I played in college.
Nice.
So that was, over 10 years ago. But I still enjoy like playing kind of competitively, but not like super competitively that it's not still fun.
Right. Yeah, yeah, yeah. There's something about volleyball. I love volleyball as a sport because there's very few sports I feel like I just hurl my body at it. Like just all in. Like, and I'm a very cautious, very controlled person. I don't like putting myself at risk. But there's something about volleyball where I'm like, look, this is why we're here. And I just hurl my body across the room, or I don't really care if I like injure myself. And for some reason that part of my brain just switches off, and I'm like all in. I don't know if it's there's a ball there. I want to win. Something overrides my fear of being hurt, which is very high most of the time. I'm scared of walking down the stairs most of the time. But you put me in a volleyball court, and I'm all in. Broken
Yeah.
bones put to the side. That's
Volleyball
cool.
can definitely do that.
Oh, yeah, yeah. I've definitely injured myself at volleyball, and I've never played on any competitive level. Probably what's happened is I've played with a bunch of people that don't really care about volleyball, and they've all kind of stared at me, going, "What is happening?" As I'm like throwing myself backwards and forwards, and they're kind of just having a bit of fun. Yeah, I don't do anything by like low key, chill, relax. That's not my vibe. My vibe is 1000%. How can we take this up to the next level? Yeah, cool. Well, I'm excited to have you on. How much time have you got? What kind of time frame are you working with? When do you need to start your day?
Well, I normally take my dog for a walk right about now.
Okay, so when
So
your dog starts howling, we need to wrap it up.
yeah, but I certainly have time.
Cool. Okay, cool. Well, we usually go about an hour and a half if that's all right. We'll we'll,
Mhm.
we'll play it by ear, and yeah, if the dog is dying, we can wrap up as well. I am 100% sure that 99% of my listeners will have a bleeding heart for a howling dog that needs to go on its walk. And so there's probably a few people that can't respond to that, but cat people, or I don't know. But
Right.
I love it. Cool. Well, let's just dive in. I'm excited. I have been following you on Instagram for a long time now. I don't know how long. It feels like everyone on Instagram just blurs into, oh yeah, I've been following them, but I can't pinpoint when I started to follow people or why or which posts like triggered it for me. But I can recall seeing your posts for a long time on my feed now. And I just love what you're doing. And so I'm really excited to talk about, seeking pleasure, having pleasure as a high goal in life. I know that's what you're all about, helping people rediscover that, maybe dive into a bit of their inner hedonist. But do you want to introduce yourself for people that aren't familiar with you? I'm sure there are people that are listening that aren't following you on Instagram and so haven't probably been tracking with you as long as I have.
Yeah, so my name is Lauren Scott. I live in Denver, Colorado, and I'm a sex and pleasure coach and an ecotherapist. So I have been supporting people in recovering from traumatic experiences, and I've been doing that for a while now, for over 5 years on the counseling side. And then about a year and a half ago, I started really pursuing pleasure and unlocking sexuality, kind of like on my own journey for a while, and then realizing it was such a huge need for so many other folks as well. So I've kind of been branching more into now religious trauma with so many folks kind of really deconstructing their faith and coming to realize that they've had really harmful experiences that were abusive within churches and religious settings.
Yeah, it does seem to be so hand in hand for so many people, that as they deconstruct, there's this like emergence, this an awakening of like, oh my gosh, there's so much stuff here. I feel like, I know for me growing up in the church, I was so blind to so many things that were realistically very unhealthy, whether they were coping mechanisms at the time or whether they were just dysfunctional relationships and interactions and different things like that. But it does feel that people that are going through these deconstructions, suddenly everything kind of comes to light and it's like, whoa, I've been pushing down pleasure. I've been, abusing myself. I have been abused by others. There's all sorts of different components there. Has that been quite a personal journey for you as well? I mean, I don't know many people that are in this work that haven't themselves kind of gone through the process of kind of unraveling their faith, reorientating, kind of figuring out where are they at. Like, did you grow up Christian? This is a leading question because I know that you were Christian and I know a few bits and pieces. But do you want to talk about like kind of how you got to where you are now? Because I'm assuming you didn't start right from the get-go as going like, okay, let's talk about religious trauma. Let's talk about how that intersects with sexual trauma and abuse and repressing our pleasure and things like that. Like that's usually not most people's starting point.
Right. Yeah. It's definitely a different world within kind of Christianity and then navigating out of that. So yeah, I grew up Christian. Like my mom became a Christian in college through Campus Crusade. And she really like raised my family to be Christian. And she was really the spiritual head of our household. My dad would go to church with us and everything. And both of my parents, they were together then, they're still together now. But it was really my mom who was kind of like the driver of our faith. And actually one of my favorite things about my family, especially like on my mom's side, is that my grandmother was like really involved in church, and she would like read the Bible and question the pastor and be really outspoken. And then her aunt who raised her, she would like preach on the street. They wouldn't let her preach in church, so she would go out on the streets and be telling people about her faith and everything. So I come from this line of kind of like these spiritual mamas who are amazing. And I think they really kind of set me up for, the work that I do now. Maybe not in the ways that they would have expected me to do that work.
Sure.
But certainly there's kind of this counter-cultural like fervor inside of me. So anyway, like I grew up in the church, kind of grew up going to non-denominational churches. So I did, to like the places that we went, I did get to see women preaching. I did get to see kind of more kind of equality between men and women in the church. So not like super conservative.
Sure.
And there are still like these elements of, all the things that like patriarchal influences and white supremacy and,
right.
all of the jazz.
These things are a spectrum, right? And so like, it's very easy to be like, oh, that's not present. Oh, well, obviously, so many people jump to like, oh, so it's not a problem. Like there's this whole world in the middle, right? And so you didn't experience, it wasn't Westboro Baptist Church or something you were growing up in, but
right.
actually they're fairly equal in a lot of ways, actually. So they're quite big on women speaking and stuff. So I don't know. But yeah, but bad example, but you weren't in the most fundamental of circles, but probably still very influenced by, a lot of problematic thinking, patriarchal stuff.
Yeah, purity culture. Definitely grew up growing to youth group and kind of like purity culture's heyday. And I'm kind of a socially awkward person, and I had a lot of social anxiety when I was growing up. So I think it kind of, in some ways, it kind of shielded me from some of the negative influences because I was too anxious to like really want to be around a lot of people or be influenced by the people around me.
So that's an interesting way to avoid peer pressure.
Right.
That's funny. I like that. Maybe I'm thinking back on myself. I was really awkward as a teenager and definitely didn't. I probably would have fit in if I put myself out there a bit more and was a bit more vocal or whatever. But I just was like, no, I'll just hide in my room at home, actually. So I probably avoided a lot of peer pressure myself in the same mechanisms. So.
Yeah. Funny. Yeah. But I definitely like, what am I even talking about? Oh, my spiritual journey. So I like was full on, like received everything about Christianity, kind of really took it in, was really strong in my faith. I went to college and I played volleyball. So I was, kind of sheltered because I was homeschooled from in middle school. And then I went to like a traditional high school. Okay. And
what was that like, going from like homeschool into like kind of the real world almost, right?
It was so hard.
Really?
It was so hard. And I went through all of the like normal kind of middle school, like awkwardness and like bullying and that kind of stuff just in high school. Just like late bloomer fashion, which is kind of my style, is taking things at my own pace. So yeah, it probably would have been, I don't know. Anyway, I was one of the few Black people in a school, like a predominantly white area. So it was like my family and then a couple of other families who are people of color. Right. So that definitely added to just the awkwardness and just feeling isolated and alone and just feeling different. And I like went to some of the youth group activities, but I wasn't super involved. Like I like going to church with my mom because that was it was safer than like being with peers. So I kind of like, I took that, my relationship with God, into college. And so I'm like an athlete playing on teams with other athletes who are kind of crazy and partying and doing all this crazy stuff. So I made it till I was about 19. And then I had some alcohol and I was like, this is great. Social anxiety, what?
You found the cure.
So I did. I was like, oh, this is why people drink alcohol. So that, I think, well, this definitely started much earlier in my life, but kind of this like double life experience of like, here's like my Christian self, and here's the self that has like sexual feelings and gets aroused and is bad, quote unquote.
Mm-hmm.
So kind of like this splitting off of self so that I can fit into all of these different areas and still maintain the image. So that was it was really impactful to kind of like feel myself splitting off. And then, you know, times where I would be in Bible studies, be like talking about what was actually going on, and then, you know, coming out as those confessions of like, oh my gosh, I masturbated and I'm the worst person ever. And, you know, those like confessions, those public confessions in front of the entire girls group, and stuff like that, where, you know, I was doing what I thought I needed to do.
Right.
And it really wasn't until, I'd say 3 or 4 years ago, that I was still like very much Christian, still very much in the fold of trying to do what God wanted me to do and trying to be this good, pure person, and learning about how people who are not like straight, you know, people, how they're treated, how people who are non-binary or transgender and how they're treated, and actually like really looking at what was going on. And I've experienced that it's been really hard. It was really hard to be a Christian and also be a therapist, because you're sitting with people's stories and you're like seeing people beyond all of like the labels that it's so easy to put up and distance yourself by labels. And so actually like sitting with kids who are like, yeah, I'm transgender, and sitting with kids who are like, I had a client who was afraid to tell her dad that she was a lesbian because she thought that he was going to rape her because he was a conservative Christian. And I was like, that is so fucked up.
Yeah.
Like beyond. So it was a lot of little experiences that just kind of like started to erode my confidence and trust in my faith. And then really looking back over my life and seeing kind of this legacy of shame that I had been following for a long time. Shame about my sexuality, shame about masturbating, shame about this experience when I was a kid where like me and my cousin were exploring our bodies in a very like natural kid way. And that was really demonized by my mom and my grandma, and how that became like a formative experience of shame in my life. And so like being able to look back at that and have a hope of seeing it in a different light, and not that I had to, I mean, I would stay up and pray for hours, like many years of my childhood, feeling so guilty and so ashamed, and, you know, like convinced that on Judgment Day, that Jesus was going to play the film of our lives on the big screen, and everybody would know every single thing that I've done that was bad, and just like make fun of me. So
yeah, that was nice. That was a terrifying thought for me as well. I remember just like, oh God, like 25% of that video would just be me masturbating. Like I was a teenager when I was thinking all this stuff. You know, I'm like, I don't really do much else, right? I'm socially awkward. I don't hang out with people. I just sit in my room and masturbate. Like I'm figuring this out. And yet I feel terrible about it the whole time, except for when I'm masturbating. This is kind of sweet spot right in there, right in the somewhere. But it's amazing how, like these kind of like stories, these things, and I'm sure they were really well intentioned. The youth pastor talking about how God would show a video of your whole life or whatever, and like I'm sure they had absolutely no desire to traumatize kids or anything like that.
Right.
But it's amazing how insidious some of this stuff can become for certain people as well. I'm always amazed by was talking to Alice Gretchen. I don't know if you're familiar with her. She just wrote a book, Waywards. It's her memoir, and it's amazing and it's fascinating. And her story is so fascinating about how much shame and guilt and bondage was just put on her shoulders. But it's funny, at the end, she kind of talks about her family and her brothers and sisters who were all going through the same churches, the same family, the same parents, the same experiences, the same schools. And none of them, they were all like, what? You thought that about God? And it's so interesting how certain people just seem to be susceptible, right? We hear that message. The person next to us somehow doesn't seem to be getting laden with shame and somehow goes on with their life happily as normal. And then someone like yourself or myself ends up traumatized, right? We're praying like 3 or 4 hours every night going, okay, God, before I go to sleep, because you might come back while I'm sleeping, or, you know, I might die in my sleep. I need to make sure I'm right with God. I need to get it sorted. Like, it's just amazing how people, can be so susceptible to that. I don't know what that is. Do you have ideas of like why is you internalize that kind of like shameful kind of you internalize those kind of messages, those kind of ideas, and made them something that oppressed you, that held you down. You didn't kind of brush it off. Like what do you think that was about yourself? And maybe even having worked with so many people, I guess, that are doing that, like what are some of the commonalities there as well? Like that cause certain people to be so harmed by this and other people not to be? Because yeah, I mean, maybe the other people just don't know yet. Maybe they're not aware. But it does seem that some people seem to be somewhat immune to it.
Yeah, I definitely think there's a personality component to it, and also like attachment. Of, you know, like having a secure relationship with a secure caregiver. Because I've noticed there's a huge correlation between religious trauma and folks who have, you know, like grown up in traumatic families. So they're having like insecure attachments with their parents, and then they go and like are kind of fed the very similar message at church. I think there's also like, I'm much more of like a empathetic, you know, like introverted person. So my first orientation is to like take things internally, and it's definitely been a huge like learning process to be like, this is not a reflection on me. So I think I do that with anything, with everything anyway. So being a kid and like not having any sort of like defense mechanism, and just like came into this core of my being. So yeah, that's a very interesting question.
Yeah, I don't know. I've not really thought about it too much. I'm fascinated by it. I remember talking to I think it was Brian Peck, and I've talked to his colleague as well, Laura Anderson, about religious trauma a lot, and talking to them about certain things like hell. And it's a misnomer that hell is traumatic as a teaching, because some people are not traumatized by hell. In fact, hell soothes their trauma. They're traumatized by the idea that there won't be a hell for the person that abused them, or for, you know, whatever, or just knowing there's a hell makes them feel safe that they're going to heaven or whatever. And then someone else is utterly traumatized, can't sleep for decades after they even leave Christianity because they're so fearful of hell. And it does seem that there's somewhere in between those two people, there must be certain ways of thinking, certain upbringings, experiences, whatever it is. And it does seem there's something there in purity culture and its effects. Like, I think, generally speaking, broad strokes, purity culture is a very unhelpful set of beliefs and things to teach. But it does seem that a lot of people grow up in purity culture and have healthy sex lives. They aren't traumatized. They aren't constantly racked with guilt over their sexuality or whatever. Those people might be few and far between. I've not met a huge amount, but I know I'm in a bubble as well. So, you know, I'm in a bubble where people come to me saying they've got a problem. And I imagine you are the same, right? You don't sit down with Christians and go, hey, I've got a fantastic sex life and my life is just all together and I love purity culture. Would you be able to counsel me about this completely separate thing that you're not specifically focusing on? And so we live in these bubbles a little bit. But it's huge. I mean, whatever that thing is, it's big. You know, there's no shortage of people that are going through that and struggling with that. So what kind of therapy were you doing before? Because you mentioned you were giving therapy to different people, and that's kind of what sparked your questioning and your unraveling in itself. Was it just a kind of a general therapy practice that you had before this kind of process of deconstructing your faith?
Yeah, I worked at a community mental health. Actually, I
Okay.
worked at a couple, but it was a lot with kids and families. So really like
Right.
walking through a lot of really traumatic stories. And yeah, it's just so different when you're walking with people through the worst things that have ever happened to them and being like, where's God in this?
Mm,
And what do I say to this person that's comforting? Like that's really when the beautiful kind of trite Christian sayings kind of fall short, when you're like,
sure.
oh, I'm sitting with this young kid who's had this really horrendous thing happen to them.
Yeah. And were a lot of these kids from Christian backgrounds, or were they kind of quite diverse in their kind of spiritual backgrounds and stuff?
Yeah, it was pretty diverse.
Mm,
Like some kids, they were, their families were not spiritual at all. Some
mm.
kids growing up in the church and having a hard time with it. Some kids growing up in the church and loving it.
Yeah, because that's an interesting thing as well, isn't it? Because I think when we're in a church, we can kind of create this little bubble for ourselves, and we do think in the church we're all good. We've got our trite little sayings that give us a bit of peace, and we can kind of see them from a one-sided perspective, and it definitely works. And I don't really hear about any stories where it doesn't work. And the stories where it doesn't work, well, we'll pray for you, and we've got these kind of things that soothe, self-soothe. But when you step out and you look beyond that, you suddenly go, oh, this isn't this clear boundary where
Mhm.
everyone in is good, everyone out is bad, everyone in has God caring for them and loving them, and everyone out, like, it's clear their lives are chaos. Like, you suddenly realize, oh gosh, everyone is kind of in the same boat here. We're all
Mhm.
human. We're all in this big mess trying to figure out what the hell it is to be human and how to do this well.
Right.
Yeah, it's a fascinating thing. Um, yeah, and the college. So, did you then after that? Did you go back and qualify further? Was that right? I remember reading this in your
Mhm.
bio. You went back to do more counseling.
Mhm.
So where does that fit in the process of you kind of like questioning your faith and stuff? Was that still before you kind of started to
Mhm.
question your faith? Okay.
Yeah. So I actually, for my master's degree, I went to a Christian university.
Oh, interesting. Yeah. Fascinating. And how was that for you? Because I think there's something about, I am very cautious in my experience. Counseling in Christianity can be a very interesting combo. And so, how was it, going through the process of training in counseling at a Christian institution? Like, what was that like for you? Was your prior degree from a kind of secular institution? Yeah.
Mhm.
Okay. Yeah. So it's not like you had an undergrad from a Christian institution as well, and you kind of kept going in that world. What was it like for you in that Christian college?
Um, it wasn't great. Um, I hated most of it, actually. It
Wow.
was like, let me be honest about this.
They're probably not listening. Don't worry.
Um, I, yeah, just, I think that was my first eye opener for how politicized the church had
Mm,
begun. Um, and but it was so subtle that like at the time I was like, there's some things here that are weird. And I don't know if I necessarily agree with it, but it wasn't until I like finished my master's degree and like got all the way through it that I was like, shoot, like there were some real things that I did not agree with. And I actually would like all of the money that I gave you for this master's degree back.
right.
Um,
Wow, interesting.
So yeah, it's
What timeline was this? This is around the time of Trump, right? I can't remember exactly, but was it like
um
2015, something like that?
I
Just before.
oh my gosh, I graduated in 2015. So
Okay.
um
So just before really it all
just
kicked off.
before, and I'm like I'm so grateful. Because I don't think I would have survived like through the Trump era.
Yeah. I am very thankful that I haven't had to spend too much time in the presence of American evangelical Christians for the last 4 years. Let me say that, because that's a lot harder than life should be.
Mhm.
Wow. So, I mean, you mentioned like, the school being very politicized and that causing, I mean, does that come into education for counseling? Like, when you're being, to me, it's quite fascinating. I've only been to a secular institution for education, but like, I struggle to see why that is a thing. Like, I'm so fascinated by like how these lines bleed, how these things become. How does a college or university become its political affiliation become remotely relevant in teaching you how to be a good counselor, and helping you
It shouldn't.
build your master's degree. It just doesn't seem. I don't even know how that works.
Mhm.
But yeah, like what are your thoughts in it? Like, what is it that is so? I don't even know. I don't even know what the right question is. How do these institutions become this way? Why is it important to them? Um, yeah, was it important to your other peers going through college? Did you feel like most people were on board with the kind of politicization of it?
Um, that is a good question. I would actually say for the people who are in my cohort, everyone was pretty, um, well, actually, I don't know, because we never talked about politics. Like it wasn't,
Mm,
when I was going through my master's degree, it wasn't like it is now. So it was pretty divided, but it wasn't like, the Grand Canyon of being
right.
divided. Um, so yeah, like the thing is about counseling is that you're supposed to meet people where they're at and you're supposed to be neutral and
Mm,
you're supposed to have enough ability to be cognitively flexible to like be with other worldviews. And like I have just recently gotten rid of most of my counseling books, but I remember like counseling from a Christian perspective, but not being a Christian counselor was really challenging.
mm,
And so they have like of course you build your theoretical framework and that's kind of like what you're operating from. But I remember one of the books by Balswick and Balswick about human sexuality. And they were just talking about like different theories of human sexuality, but it was all like just like Christian based. And
mm,
I'm realizing, like then coming and studying sexuality and tantra from a much different lens and being like, oh my gosh, there's so many different theories out there. There's so many
right.
different ways of thinking about things. And like, how can you just keep everything within this tight little box and then be giving people a degree to go and help other people in the world
Right.
and listen to their stories? Like, it
With like the
just
smallest toolkit in
blows
the
my
world.
mind. Exactly. Like, it's one thing to like pump out Christian counselors. And it's a whole other thing to like, we did one crisis and trauma class, we did one like cultural competency class, and that was it.
Wow.
And like talking to my other friends who went to secular universities and studied social work, they like had all of these really complex discussions about what it means to be like to have a mainstream gender identity and what it means to come from a marginalized identity and what it means to like support people who are like different from you. And I was like
Mm,
feeling like I got cheated. because everything was so narrowly focused in my degree.
Yeah.
And I had no idea.
Yeah. It's so hard. I mean, if you're a Christian, and it's so hard for me to even think back to that point. It's not that long ago, but it's so hard to think back to that point and then to think back to the point without. I'm not me today back then going, oh, look how dumb this is. I'm in. I'm like there, and I'm seeing it from that perspective. But when you can do that on some level, there's no option. Right? Who was the Christian that was going to write the book to explore the very many multifaceted ways to explore tantric sex? Which Christian was going to write the Christian book on that? Right? It's not going to happen, right? Because you're not allowed. Even just reading about Tantra, you're going to open yourself up to the demonic, or who knows, like what kind of Christian language will suddenly start bubbling up, and you're getting kicked off any boards that you're on, and you're immediately like, you're no longer an elder at the church, or whatever. Like it just isn't an option to like explore all these different things to broaden your toolkit, right? It's hard for. It seems, certainly in looking over the last couple of years especially, it's hard for an evangelical to say, hey, can we talk about racism? That shouldn't be a hard conversation. That should be a very big thing where everyone goes, well, yeah, like, yes, let's talk about that. Let's explore it. Are we still being racist? Gosh, how can we be better? Like, you'd hope. But when that's not on the table, no wonder, so many other things, they're just not on the table. And it is my concern when I look at certain things like that. Like I talk to different people, and I know people that have found Christian counselors to be very helpful for them, even while they're going through deconstruction. So it's not a black and white, yes, no, in, out. It just isn't as dualistic as that. But I do know so many people that have hit walls because Christian counselors, it's hard to divide who you are from your practice. Like, I don't know how that works. Yeah, it's a really interesting dynamic. Like, is that something that you, presumably before this, you would have on some level seen yourself as a Christian and a counselor? Like, how did you navigate that? Like, did you find at times where you were presented with stuff and it was pushing you in ways that you were uncomfortable with, or you couldn't cope with? Or do you look back and maybe can critique yourself and go, gosh, I wasn't able to give the right advice then, and I ended up giving something that was the right Christian advice, but looking back, I'm like, that was not the right advice for that kid or person or whatever. Like, can you talk about navigating that world and maybe how that shifted for you?
Yeah, the biggest thing that comes to mind is I felt such pressure to fix people, and to make sure that I was using the right tools and doing the right things so that people would not be in pain anymore. And my capacity just to be with like, okay, this person's going through something really hard, and my job is just to be with them in this really hard thing, was pretty low for a long time. And it's definitely something that's hard for me to admit. And it's hard for me to really look back at my, my work that I've done over the past few years. Like, of course, like I didn't know I was a new counselor, and, we're all just,
of course. We're all growing,
just
right?
trying
We're all
to figure it out.
Absolutely. And even when we're looking back and going, oh, that wasn't as good as it could have been, I'm sure you helped tremendously in loads of different ways. We're so mean to ourselves, aren't we? We're always like, that was the worst thing ever. I'm terrible at this, or not the most self-compassionate practice. But yeah. Anyway, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. But
yeah, it's just, I think they're, the way that I experienced Christianity was like, yeah, but let's just get to the happy ending. Let's just get to the part where Jesus comes back and everything's fine. And not so much the part of we're gonna, be with each other in the suffering. And it's so interesting to me that like how we're wired, like the co-regulation aspect, like that is what the comfort is in suffering. It's like being able to be with other people in suffering is what brings the comfort. And so I think looking back on so many of the teachings that I grew up in, there's still so many things where I'm like, yeah, that's absolutely true. Just the way that I interpreted it and the way that I heard it was completely different than than how I see it now. Because I'm a different person, you know.
Yeah, of course. So funny. Yeah, I that's an interesting component to me. Christianity can be very end game, very get the person saved, very we're going to heaven, this world can burn up, I don't care. It's very like all or nothing. It's very like, let's end the suffering, let's get to the paradise. It's you know, earth can burn, let's get to heaven. And the way that does play out is yeah, I mean, really problematic. You'll know as a practitioner, like trying to rush people to the happy ending doesn't work, right? I mean, it might work for a couple of people, maybe if they're in the right place at the right time, maybe they've done the work already and they've come to you at just the right time or whatever. But oh man, like, yeah, I mean, everyone's gone through some sort of pain, right? You've been through a divorce, you've been through the death of a loved one, and someone has come along and go, don't worry, it'll be fine. Or, you know, like, and they've given that, like that pat Christian, the thing at the end that maybe isn't even wrong. Like, yeah, you will be fine. Man, that's probably true. Yeah. But you want to punch them in the face when they say it, right? Because it's not the right time to let you know that you'll be fine. What I want to do is sit down, put your arm around me and cry. That's what I want. I want someone to cry with. And Christianity does struggle with that, which is, it's a fascinating component because obviously the Jewish practice is the very opposite. It's the sit and Shiva, like you sit, you mourn with people. It's interesting to see how Christianity sort of evolved away from that in a lot of ways. And maybe there's good portions of Christianity that still do that practice. I know many Christians that can navigate that very well. But yeah, it's an intriguing component for sure that we're always trying to rush people to the end. And that just isn't helpful. You know, the suffering is in some ways the meat, you know, it needs to be gone through. Yeah. Wow. Okay. So, and so when you had finished up practicing, like how did you, talk to me about your actual deconstruction. Talk to me. So what you start having some questions, you're working with different clients and it's provoking these questions. Maybe you've had the experience of like, you know, your Christian college and how political it would be. And these kind of things are niggling away at you. Like, how did you navigate that personally? How did you go through these questions? What were they bringing up? And, you know, what were your fears? What were your doubts? Were you excited about it? Like, talk to me about what's going on in your life at that point.
Yeah. So at that point, I think once it got to the level that I couldn't ignore it anymore, I was living at a house with 4 other women. We were all going to the same church, like very much in this bubble. Like, you know, my roommates were amazing. They are amazing people. I love them still so much, but it got to this point of like, I was having panic attacks. Like they would have like worship services in our house. So people would come over. Like our house was like it was a pretty big house. So, you know, lots of people would come over and hang out. And so I remember this one day, there was like a 50-person worship service. They were scream singing. And I was like in my room having a panic attack. Like I have to get out of here. So I stopped going to church that summer. I moved out. I moved back into my parents' house. I kind of like went into the dark cave to just like, you know, like silence all the voices in my head and all the voices around me, just to be like, what does my voice sound like? And I'm a 9 on the Enneagram. And so like my ability to merge is very strong. And so like having to come back to myself and come back to my own energy is like such an important process because I just get lost in the crowd. And it really was a very scary time of part of me is like super rebellious and was like, I want to do all of the things because I really want to like test things. Like I had dated a guy who was not a Christian and like nothing bad happened. And he was a really great guy. And I wanted to like read all the books and like see if like the demons were going to jump on me and do all of the things. And at the same time, like also waking up at 3 o'clock in the morning, like in a fit of fear, like, oh my
Right.
gosh, they're coming, you know, like seeing all the shadows and like expecting the demons to come. So there's kind of like both, you know, both experiences of like, I'm afraid of hell. And I also want to like question and push boundaries and to like experience more things. So it was very lonely for me. It was very lonely because I didn't know of anyone else who was asking the same questions or going through the same process, and not sure who to talk to. And I'm looking back on it, I'm sure I could have talked to more people around me, because in my mind, I'm like, they're going to judge me and they're going to reject me and they're going to shun me. And I don't think that was necessarily the case. For many of my friends, I think they would have accepted me, but I just didn't trust that.
Right. It's really hard to trust that, isn't it? I know a lot of people have had a great multitude of experiences on a whole spectrum of like, you know, from I'm going to kill you all the way to like, oh, that's great, me too, I'm also deconstructing, you know. So there's everything in the middle between those two, and most people are somewhere in the middle, right? Most people are human and they're scared by your deconstruction, but they love you and they're trying to figure it out as well. But it's really hard to trust other people are going to be accepting and loving and kind, when I think a lot of the time it comes down to the fact that we know that we might not have been. You know, if we put ourselves in that shoe, like 10 years ago, someone had come to me and said, I don't know what I believe and I'm scared and I'm blah, 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 I'd be really worried about them. I'd try and get them saved. I'd try and fix them and whatever. And so, or we've heard those stories, right? How many times have we been in the middle of a conversation where it's like, oh, did you hear about Bob? Like he's questioning and we all better be praying for him, you know? And it's basically code for saying, oh, well, the devil's got him now, you know, or whatever. And so I think, and we tend to focus on that much more than the other conversations that we have all had as well, probably, where there were probably Christians that were like, oh gosh, they're questioning and they'll figure it out. It'll be fine. You know, God's bigger than that. It'll be okay, whatever. You know, like we forget about the person that responds like that. And we remember the person that's like, oh yeah, they're the worst, you know, let's put them on the prayer chain. Or and so we're paranoid about the bad outcome. And we forget that there are like great people out there that can navigate that with you. So you went through this largely on your own then, processing this. What was the, you know, you talk about kind of sitting on that like knife's edge of like, you know, trying these new, exciting, wonderful things and the world not ending, but at the same time, you know, wake up in the middle of the night and go, oh, maybe the world is ending. Actually, I'm not sure, you know. What was it that pushed you over the edge? What was it that got you to a place where you could kind of start coming out on the other side and feeling confident in where you were at, and, you know, maybe some of the life choices that you were now starting to move towards and things that you were willing to let go of, things you were willing to embrace? Like, what gave you some like confidence in that process? Was it just time, or was there more to it?
Yeah, it was certainly time. And there's this, I actually worked with a healer, and she does this technique called clearing influences. And it's just like a way of really like processing your emotions about something. And it's typically used with like family relationships or like trauma. But I've been working with this process around Christianity and racism and kind of like my relationship with God and all of these things that has been really helpful to kind of come to an internal resolution. And then like seeing, it's been so helpful to see more people and to hear more stories and to like notice that it's not black and white. Like there's a lot of gray, there's a lot of nuance and complexity. And it's really beautiful to like be with the nuance and the complexity, and to not have to have all the answers, and to not have conclusions. For me, learning how to be with questions, learning how to be like in the inquiry that's kind of lived out day by day has been so helpful.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I can see that being really helpful. It's amazing to see how different people kind of navigate this and process this. And I guess as someone that had been given a lot of tools, even maybe in a limited set within certain contexts of maybe the Christian kind of background of your master's program or different things, but you have a lot of things on the table in front of you that you can pull from and go, oh gosh, here's like self-compassion process at work, and here's this, you know, and I can give myself a bit of a CBT kind of work over, or, you know, like you've got certain tools at hand that I think a lot of us just don't have, you know, or maybe we might do sort of intuitively on some level at times, but most of the time we don't have that. And I guess that's a wonderful component that you had to play with as well. Almost being your own therapist, I guess, in that process and helping yourself through it. So what is it that got you into the kind of niche that you've now drawn for yourself? You know, you now are focusing on sex and pleasure. You're focusing on ecotherapy as well, which, can you explain what ecotherapy is for people? Is it just going out into nature and being healed by nature? Is that as simple as it kind of sounds, or is it?
Yeah. It's under the umbrella of eco psychology. So like the wilderness therapy experiences and kind of the like nature guiding. So it's more of just the therapy process of that. So I kind of combine it with a bunch of the other tools that I have, like Gestalt and some like parts work. But yeah, it's, you know, we go out in nature and like experience kind of like the healing of being outside, and then combine that with like therapeutic techniques.
Wow. So yeah, so what got you into these kind of niches that you've kind of carved out for yourself? Because before you were more of a general practitioner, right? Working with, you know, kids from all kinds of backgrounds and needing all kinds of assistance. Now you are much more focused in kind of who you're helping and how. Like, was that a personal journey that you went on? Was it something you just kind of went, oh, I think I'd like to do this? Or what kind of made you kind of like focus on those areas?
Yeah, it's a lot of my niches have been born from crisis. So I got to a point, I'd say 2017, 2018, when I was just so burnt out from therapy work. And I really wanted to quit. And I found this training in California of like going out and being with nature. And I noticed that when I was taking clients on walks, that it was just easier. It was easier for me as the therapist and the practitioner. It was easier for them to kind of talk. And I started to do some research, and I found this ecotherapy training. And I had one of the most profound experiences of just like being seen and belonging. Like I participated in the first demo of our ecotherapy training, and it was like this 8-day experience in the woods, and I camped all 8 days, and it was just like profound for me. And I knew it was like spiritual for sure. And I knew that I wanted to be able to offer that to people. Especially like living in Colorado, and, you know, people move here because of the mountains and that outdoor life. So that was kind of like how that was born. And then, you know, my journey towards like reclaiming my own sexuality and working through shame and working through like body image and like self-image issues kind of led me on this path of like reading a whole bunch of books about what it meant to be feminine. You know, it started with like the books about like being a good Christian woman, and then it evolved.
There's
to
no
like,
shortage of those ones.
Right. Everybody wants to tell you how to be a good Christian woman.
Right. Mostly the men as well, which is surprising.
Yeah, so I like started off with those books, and then I started reading more books about dating, because I was like, great, I don't know how to do this. And then more books about like being feminine. And then it just got to a point where I was like, I'm not learning anything from these books. And I found this training with this wonderful woman named Layla Martin. And I still remember the day when I I followed her YouTube videos. Like, she's pretty wild and she talks about orgasms and she talks about Tantra, and she gives away a lot of free content. And I remember just like seeing this video of her, and she was so vibrant and so alive and so charismatic. And I was like, oh, that's what I want to be. And so like got on the call, signed up for the training, and it ended up being like this year-long like deep dive into like your own experiences, and like really becoming embodied in like your own sexual integrity before you like work with other people. And you know, I had, and still do to some extent, like layers and layers of shame and like trauma that had been stored in my body that I had to like work through, which that's not a fast process. It's not an easy process. And so it's definitely like a path that I'm still on, learning how to go at the pace of the slowest part of me, and being able to touch these deeper and deeper parts of me with more and more tenderness and gentleness. So yeah, that's been kind of like my story. I'm hoping that like as I kind of grow and change, that I won't have to learn everything from a place of crisis and a place of like, this is an absolute emergency, I have to figure it out now. But so far, that's what it's been.
That's funny. Yeah, I guess, yeah, hopefully we heal up to the point where we can be just intentionally seeking something to work on at some point. Right. But for a long portion, it's definitely like, oh my God, there's more stuff and it's coming at me like a tsunami. I need to deal with it or I'm going to drown. Absolutely. What did that look like for you? I mean, what was the process of, you know, starting to heal from sexual shame? I mean, what does that look like for people that, because I guarantee there are no shortage of people listening to this. You know, we're talking a high percentage are going, yep, that's me. And that's something I want to intentionally work on. And a lot of people can reach out to someone like yourself. There's other great people that are doing really good work in helping people in sexual shame, especially from like a religious background and things like that. But that's not possible for everyone, right? Not everyone is as capable or in a financial place or whatever. Like, what were some of the kind of the practical things that, like, you know, you found helped you? What were some of the big things that kind of moved the needle for you?
Yeah, getting a proper education about sex and like the functions of the human body. The first book that we read in my program was Come As You Are, by Emily Nagoski, and she's a PhD sex educator. And like just learning about like the anatomy and the functions of the human body, so good. So like that's the first place where I recommend, because for me, learning that the way that my arousal system works is normal and there's nothing wrong with it, there's nothing like shameful about it, was like so freeing for me to be like, oh, like I'm fine, like I'm not broken. And so that is, I think, yeah, like having that experience of empathy and someone else, like, you know, if you can't do something like counseling or coaching or something like that, read books about it, watch YouTube videos about it, like do your own research about like how the body functions from accredited sources, of course, because there's a lot of bullshit out there.
Yeah,
but
don't pick up the book
on
from Focus on the Family or something, you know?
Right. Please don't.
No. Or like most of us teenage boys learned sex from was like Pornhub or something like that as well. You know, like your
Yeah.
options were like some sort of terribly uninformed Christian or some sort of like ridiculous male gaze focused romanticization, or I don't know if romanticization is even the right word. That's definitely not really, is it? Is fetishization and overly, you know, whatever photogenicization of sex and whatever it is, like movies, porn. But that's basically what most Christians grew up on, this weird balance of two things that neither is particularly real or healthy. And yeah, wow. Okay, so great. So who was the author of that? The Come As You Are, and it was Emily
Nagoski.
Nagoski. So I mean, that's great as a very entry waypoint, is this educating yourself. There's no shortage of education. I mean, there's great apps out there that you can download. There's all sorts of different things that, yeah, it's a great way to kind of start exploring and rooting out that shame. I think it's so healing hearing from an expert that what you experience is normal, which I guess, you know, it sounds like to me that, you know, things like, oh, you get aroused, that wasn't a message of normality for you. Like you grew up and that was not something that people were like, oh, it's normal to be aroused. Like, which is terrifying. That's a terrifying thing that no one told you that was normal or even good. No, never mind normal. Yeah, it's really scary, really scary. And so in exploring that and in sort of dealing with shame, because there's almost two ends of a spectrum there, isn't there? There's kind of being buried in shame. And as you kind of start to kind of peel back those layers, you almost become more proactive and start to explore the kind of the pleasure and the fun and that side of it. Is that really what it looked like for you? This focus on pleasure now, is it kind of like continuing on a trajectory that you've begun now? Would that be a fair thing to kind of say? Is that what people can expect? Because I'm sure people maybe stuck in this don't know what the future holds for them, because their interaction with sexuality, with sex, with their body has only been negative so far, I'd imagine, for a lot of people.
Yeah, it's one of the coaches that I've worked with, I've loved, she really emphasizes permission as the first step. Is like, you have this permission just to have, like, own your body as yourself. And especially for women, that's a really powerful message of like, oh, your body gets to be your own, and you get to say yes or no, I like this or I like that, or like you get to own your own pleasure, you get to own your own experiences and your sensations and the things that you feel. And then from there, it's like coming back to innocence, coming back to reverence, coming back to the sacredness of our bodies as like these vessels of the sacred. You know, if you want to go that route, like being the embodiment of the divine, like our bodies have to be, they get to be something much more than just like meat suits that house our thinking brains.
Right.
Which that kind of, you know, it goes back into some past philosophical beliefs and stuff that really form particularly the Western culture and like how we think and how we view our bodies as being less than the brain, and like our emotions as being less than our thoughts, and our thinking and being rational is like the way to go. So all of that kind of bleeds into everything. But really learning, like, actually our bodies are so much more than machines. They have this like intelligence and this wisdom. And if we're able to like listen to it, it really can change our lives, change how we experience our lives.
So how does that look like? What does it look like for me, for someone that has come out of kind of sexual shame, that's maybe finding themselves now, they've done the work, you know, they've educated, they've got to the place where they're enjoying sex again, they feel free to have sex or whatever it looks like, or maybe in their marriage, their sexual lives transformed or becoming kind of a bit more free and open, and they are kind of coming out of that place, but they are wanting to move into exploration of pleasure. Like, because I think there's almost it really is two very different mentalities on some level. To just deal with your shame, like it's one thing to acknowledge, oh, shame is holding me back. It's a whole other thing to kind of, I think as Christians, we're taught like hedonism is the worst, right? You know, this pursuit of pleasure is not a good thing. We shouldn't be pursuing pleasure. We shouldn't be just seeking enjoyment. And these things are, they're seen as this kind of vain, and again, it's kind of very this Cartesian kind of like modern influence on spirituality and whatever. But yeah, it has pushed down the kind of pursuit of pleasure. Did you experience that as you were kind of trying to explore pleasure? Did you experience like there was a difference between just working on shame? Because it's easy. I think even Christians would say, oh, well, shame's not good. You know, you want to, no one wants you to be shameful, even if they're maybe perpetuating that for themselves and things like that. Like they wouldn't say that shame is an outcome that they look for. But I think certain people, even after dealing with their shame, would go, oh, yeah, but we're not supposed to be just driven by wanting pleasure. And that's such a carnal thing. And it's such a, whatever. And a lot of that is probably very rooted in our Christian upbringing. But I think a lot of it's quite societal as well. I think we are quite wired not to be just these carnal, fleshy beings that, you know, like are just driven by lust and enjoyment. And these are the kind of things we start to think of, right? It's the caricatures that we bring up and we go, oh, no. Like, how did you deal with that? How do people go through that process? And you know, if that's something that they want to start exploring and opening themselves up to, like pursuing pleasure, finding pleasure for themselves, where do you begin?
Yeah. So the language that we use is so important, and the definitions that we have to these words is so important. And the way that I define pleasure is just the sensory experience of delight. So it's just like what happens in our brains when we're doing something that brings us delight, that brings us joy. And there's so many different ways of experiencing pleasure, and we've for so long just stuck it in the sex camp, where it's like it can be pleasurable to like eat a delicious meal, or to like have a conversation with your kid or your spouse, or to sit in the sunlight. And so I think it's really important to like broaden the definition of pleasure and to really look at like the pleasure. When I look back on my Christian experiences, pleasure was not banned in its entirety. It was just like the more seedy experiences of pleasure that was at someone else's expense. Like, of course, like I'm not advocating for someone to express their desires, like as, you know, like maybe someone who has more taste of like pedophilia or something like that.
Right, sure.
Like it's definitely rooted in integrity, and it's rooted in relationship, and it's rooted in like, yes, like there are things that bring me delight that are mine, that I can enjoy. And there's desires that we have that teach us something. So maybe a desire to go out and to have sex with 100 people in a day is there. And maybe someone doesn't pursue that desire, but just examines it for the message that it's going to teach them. And not that that's necessarily a bad thing. You know, that's not a choice that's in line with my integrity at this point. So I think there's so much nuance to pleasure, but like really grounding it in whatever your value system is and whatever is in line with your integrity. And sometimes we have to like kind of go beyond what we're comfortable with in order to really know what our boundaries are, to really know what it is that, like, yes, this works for me, that totally doesn't work for me. You know, and some people just know, and some people need to experiment. And so there's lots of different ways of figuring that out.
Yeah, I guess especially for those of us that were always told what those boundaries were, it's very hard for us to, you know what is my kind of internal moral compass and what is my internalized kind of pre-programming by someone else who is also internalized pre-programming. And this dates back to, gosh, hunter-gatherers worshiping the sun, or, like, I mean, at a certain point, like if we just keep following this back, yeah, they were still doing that. And that was their boundary for what was right and wrong. And we've just kind of kept it going. At a certain point, that's very ingrained in me and my society. And I'm probably going to have to push past some form of comfort or boundary to figure out, oh no, that really is something I'm not comfortable with, or, oh, that is okay. Now, I'm not saying like you, I'm not saying like, oh, well, give yourself a bit of a push, maybe murder one person to see if it's for you or not.
Right.
Like, of course, I'm saying, like we do things that are legal. We value other people and their autonomy and their freedom and their choice. And, like, of course, there's all sorts of components that we incorporate into that. But yeah, you might have to sleep with someone to go, you know what? I'm not into very, very casual sex. I want it to be a bit more meaningful than that. And that's a bummer, but it's no harm done at the same time, right? I'm still a healthy, whole human being because I've already dealt with the shame that my value is linked to who I sleep with or how often I sleep with someone, or if I have ever slept with someone. That's gone. That component is gone. So I'm free to make a quote unquote mistake, figuring it out. And I think that's a beautiful thing. And I love what you said as well of decoupling pleasure from these kind of like single kind of hotspot focuses that we're so fixated on growing up as Christians, and maybe culturally as well. I think we're very fixated on sex and money and different things like that. But certainly in Christianity, we hear pleasure, we hear things like that. And, it's whatever the pastor that was all over Twitter recently who was like, oh, people only deconstruct so they can go and have sex with someone. And I'm like, really? I'm like, seriously? What? Like, are you kidding? Like, really? That just makes no sense. Like, I'm like, first of all, how many people are in loving, committed, like monogamous relationships that deconstruct? They're already having sex and they don't want to have sex with anyone else, but they deconstruct. I'm like, it's just so many components where that just immediately falls apart.
Right.
Whatever. But like the point being though, this guy can't think through the process and topic of deconstruction without making it about sex. For him, like he's filtering everything through sex. And I am maybe projecting myself onto him because I know as a Christian, I filtered everything through the concept of sex. Constantly, I was thinking about sex and mostly like, when was the last time I masturbated and how mad is God at me? And have I done enough good deeds in between that and now to feel close enough to God to pray properly or to raise my hands in worship without a lightning bolt hitting me or, who knows? But like, I'm constantly incorporating everything to do with sex. And I think if you spoke to me in the past and mentioned pleasure, I would have thought sex. Hell, I wasn't going to be having sex. I was still like this uncomfortable, awkward, bumbling person that was addicted to porn and masturbating, but definitely not having sex with anyone because I couldn't talk to girls and tell them I liked them, So like, but I'm still, everything's about sex. And it's so interesting to think that there's a way to orient ourselves where, of course, we think of sex as pleasurable. If that's where you're at, you're not particularly asexual or anything like that. But that's not our only. You really think the only way to be pleased and to have pleasure is to have sex? Gosh, like, what are you going to do for the rest of your day, every day, all week, all month? Like, like, what are you going to do? I don't know, when your wife's just had a kid and like, you can't have sex for a while and, you give her space or whatever. Like, really? Yeah, whatever. It's just so fascinating to me. I love, are you familiar with Dr. Tina Schermer Sellers? And she talks about sex as being so much more than intercourse and exploring that broad gambit. But I love the idea of looking beyond that even to like just a full spectrum of pleasure, of delight, of enjoyment, of creation, of life. It gets me happy. It gets me excited. I really like that. Is that so for you? Is that where the kind of ecotherapy kind of breaks in? Is it giving people space to find delight and pleasure outside of their normal worlds? I guess most people don't live outside and spend as much time outside as probably we'd like to. But how does that incorporate with pleasure for you? The ecotherapy.
That's a great question. And I hadn't really thought about it in these terms. But yeah, I think For me, it's been such a huge part of my life is being outside in nature and really learning how to reconnect to just the fact that we come from the earth. Like our bodies are like made of all of the stuff that is here on this earth. And then when we die, it kind of like that, the decomposition process, like the returning back to the earth. So it really is this beautiful experience of bringing connection to something larger than yourself. And especially when human relationships can be so difficult, being able to tap into like a nature experience and being able to like see animals and birds and things just kind of happen naturally is such a beautiful way of connection and a beautiful way of having that like suspended timelessness experience of like, there's no rush, there's no pressure to like make anything happen or do anything or like be super left brain. It's like, oh, you can just be and like watch the world kind of evolve around you as it does.
Yeah, that's, it gets me excited. It makes me want to go outside. Even though the weather's not great. My wife and I, yesterday, we love watching documentaries about all sorts of different things. And we stumbled across this documentary of, it's called like Living with the Amish. And it was about people in the UK, some kids, basically teenagers that went over to America and lived with different Amish communities. And they were lucky enough, the Amish communities let them film them and things like that. And it's really fascinating. But one of the things they took away when they came back, where they were just like, the pace of life, when you take out technology, when you take out a lot of the rush of we've got to build this big business and create an amazing empire. We care what our family looks like on social media, or, you know, all these things. And I'm not saying that Amish people can't be vain or can't be any of other things, or, you know, that they're human. So they're susceptible to all of the kind of full range. But there's a component of just living so much slower, so much more in tune with nature. You know, that life just doesn't rush by in the way that it does, I think, in our day-to-day. Like, gosh, I wake up and it's like 8 in the morning, and the first thing I think is like, oh my gosh, I've got this to do, and then I've got that, and then I've got that, and then I've got that, and I'm already thinking my way through to like midnight to go to bed again, you know, like, and I'm just waking up. Like, what happened to like, just waking up, just being here, just being present, you know, like take an hour to think, to meditate, to do some yoga or something. It's such a fast-paced life, and it's hard to do that when you go for a walk in the hills. You just don't do it as much, right? You do just go, well, I'm going for a walk in the hills. Like, you know, what else am I going to do? I can't do much out in there's no cell reception, and there's no one else to talk to. And I'm just here. I'm just being. That's a profoundly healing thing for me. I found, you know, just being out in nature and just finding when I walk, like just touching a tree and just thinking, gosh, this has been here for like 100 years. Like you know, my grandparents weren't alive when this tree was a sapling. That's very, there's something just incredibly grounding to this earth, this place that we reside, with things like that thought, you know, the redwoods in California that were around before Jesus was, you know, and you're just like, whoa, that's kind of crazy. You know, it's just, yeah, weird. I don't know. I don't know what it is about it for me that does that, but I just, it humbles me, maybe makes me realize that like this life that I'm rushing through is kind of insignificant in the space of, you know, a mountain or the sea, or I don't know. It's really fascinating. Tell me about your ecotherapy. So how does that look like? If, you know, someone's going for a walk with you and going through this, like, what does that look like? Is it you're just talking to them, going through kind of talk therapy as you walk, or is there more to it? Is it just the practice of being outside? Is that just naturally you trust in that being healing? Like, what does it look like to do ecotherapy?
Yeah, it can look like a lot of different things. My theoretical orientation is really somatic. So it's a lot of like mindfulness, a lot of paying attention to body sensations and emotions and images and kind of like the internal world. So for some people, we do a lot of walking and talking. And for some people, it's a lot of like, let's take kind of this internal experience you're having and externalize it. So we could like say this tree over there is your dad and that bush over there is your mom, and like let's explore the relationship that they have with each other and with you, and why did you choose those kind of aspects of nature to be this reflection of your internal world. So I love doing kind of experiential processes with people, because I think it's like life, you know, it's so much easier to practice something in your day-to-day life if you've also practiced it with someone who's like helping guide you through.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, there's so much data there showing that somatic therapy is definitely kind of opening up as a major player in the world of therapy moving forward. That, like, I mean, almost everyone I talk to is like, talk therapy is on the way out, or certainly dwindling, or certainly showing to be less valuable than we have valued it in the past. And that, you know, these kind of more experiential practices are so important and so huge. And so that's really fascinating to me. Do you have thoughts? I see that you offer EMDR, is that right? Yeah. Do you have thoughts on it? Because I know I've talked to certain people that are very pro EMDR. A lot of people that have had trauma and things like that are really into it. I've also talked to people that are really like, it's like pseudoscience, or, you know, or that it works, but it's not because of the EMDR. It works because of the practice of what you're doing and different things. Can you talk to me about that? Because I'm really interested. And I know it's maybe not you're not maybe the world's leading expert on EMDR. I'm not expecting you to be or anything, but can you talk to me about why you found that to be so helpful, maybe? And you know, because I know a lot of people ask me about it, and I'm kind of torn, because I'm like, this is not my world at all. And I've talked to people that are really into it. I talked to people that are really not. And I don't know. I just don't know. Figure it out. But as someone that offers it, I'd be really interested to hear what you think about the process.
Yeah. So in my experience, EMDR is really helpful for people who have certain experiences. Like, I found it to be really helpful for people who have trauma, like a single event or an event that happened like not as a part of like developmental trauma or attachment trauma or complex trauma. What I've found is that people who have more complicated traumatic experiences, like there's a lot more like trust building with like the body, and being able to tolerate body sensations before we can even get to EMDR. And I think like, because it's been effective for people who've experienced certain traumatic experiences, it's kind of like everybody wants to do it. Right. But then when we're actually like looking at what people's experiences are, if there's a lot of like chaos or disorganized attachment internally, EMDR is not effective and actually can be harmful. So I'm kind of like I think it's great for some circumstances, but it's certainly not like the trauma, you know, the fix it tool.
The one size fits all. Yeah, that's really interesting to me, and it makes a lot of sense to me. I guess because most of the people I've heard that have been more critical of it are people within the kind of religious trauma field, which generally speaking is going to be complex trauma. It's not it's very rarely a single kind of focused event. Whereas outside of maybe the religious trauma kind of world, and maybe outside of the last kind of 5-10 years, most trauma that was talked about was single impact trauma, kind of one moment. And so I can see why, a lot of people that have these kind of big traumatic events can kind of see that helpful, but other people are suddenly going, oh, this isn't actually going to work on a lot of different variations. And that's really interesting. So you talk with complex trauma, which is probably most relevant to people listening to this, kind of religious trauma kind of backgrounds. You talk about, you know, kind of learning to trust the body, to, you know, get into the body and feel the body and experience sensations and things like that. I'm really intrigued by this because I have very, very low interoception. I'm very bad at like what my body's feeling and things like that. I've got a whole host of different other things. So I'm a therapist's nightmare because I have aphantasia, so I can't picture things in my head. It's not possible. So if you say picture a red elephant, I can't see an elephant in my head and I can't color it. Sorry. I can think of the words red elephant, or I know what that would be, but I can't picture it. And so certain things, you know, very visual kind of practices, feeling things in my body, I find really hard. And I know some of those you're maybe listening and going, these are red flags for trauma, Phil. These are red flags, right? So I know that as well. But I'm also imagining that other people that are going through these have these kind of more complex, broad kind of experiences of trauma. Like, what are some of the helpful kind of practices that some people can maybe be exploring, maybe even on their own, if they're not working with a practitioner, that is helping them to learn to be more in their body, learn to kind of explore this in a safe way? Obviously, you know, you can really uncap your trauma in really unsafe ways, of course. So don't dive in head first, everyone. But, you know, what would you kind of suggest for people that are in that place, you know, that it's not a one-time thing. It isn't something that might be something like EMDR might be as effective in. It is going to be maybe a long, slow process of kind of learning to be present, learning to be a bit more somatic.
Yeah. A lot of like places to start is usually outside of the body. And so like getting for people who are having struggling with a lot of anxiety and depression, or, you know, just having an activated nervous system or being totally shut down. It's like just starting with like noticing that your body on an ideological level is safe in the present moment. And one of the things that I've heard recently in a trauma training actually is that listening to the bird sounds is actually this ancient practice that people have been doing since forever, because that signals safety to our like brainstem, like the part of us that is like super ancient technology, because, you know, fight or flight, that part of our nervous system has been around to keep us alive for a long time. And so like from like hunter-gatherer days, if birds were around, then there's not a predator around.
Right. You're not about to be eaten by a wolf or something.
Right. Yeah. So it's just like cues like that in our environment can be like, oh, this chair that I'm sitting on is stable and my feet are touching the ground. And actually orienting towards pleasure is one of the things that can be really helpful, is like turning our brains to, oh, I have flowers on my desk and they're really beautiful, or I can see the trees outside, and reorienting again to like, I'm safe here in this present moment and something beautiful is around me that's really supportive. I think is a great place to start.
That's so good. That's really interesting to me. I've been struggling a lot with anxiety and all sorts of different stuff in the last couple of months. And I've had some different health factors that have probably played in, and probably my anxiety's probably played into them. It's kind of this chicken egg scenario where it's just a terrible downward spiral. But as part of that, I've been trying to put aside in the morning some time to do some yoga or Tai Chi and some meditation. And I do it in the back room in our house, which has like these double doors open up into our garden. And even though it's freezing cold, because we live in England, I open the doors because as I'm meditating or doing yoga, I love hearing the birds. And I was just thinking about it. I didn't really actually even acknowledge that that's what it was until my wife had a day off and she's like, oh, I'll do some meditation with you. And I went to open the doors and she's like, it's freezing cold. What are you doing? And I'm like, oh, sorry. So I closed the door. But as I was meditating, I was like, you know what? I miss the sound of the birds. That's why I want the door open. I love like that. There's something really grounding about that. So I've never thought of it from that perspective, of that kind of evolutionary, I am safe from prey kind of component. That's isn't that amazing that like, birds, who gives much thought to birds most of the day, right? And yet they literally are around us, soothing our brainstem, you know, calming it down and going, you are safe, you are safe, you are safe, as they sing. I love that. It's absolutely amazing. Lauren, thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate it. If people are interested in working with you, in getting in touch with you, in kind of following you, what are some of the best ways to go about doing that?
Yeah, I'm on Instagram more, I would say most often. So my Instagram handle is Lauren H. Scott. And I have a website, havenwholeness.com is my kind of coaching practice. And for clients in Colorado who are interested in therapy, my website is Grace Springs Counseling.
Right. Of course, because in America you have to be state-based. So is that, you just kind of get around that by kind of doing more kind of like coaching beyond kind of Colorado if you do online and stuff? I know a lot of people do that. Brilliant. So yeah, so you're not limited to have to work with people. So if people are listening to this from outside of Colorado, they are still welcome to contact you. And is there a particular type of client? I know we've kind of touched on certain types, but is there a sort of like a parameter for people that you work with, generally speaking?
Yeah, for therapy, I mostly work with, clients who've experienced trauma, but they could be, anyone who fits in with that. For coaching, I work with a lot of, mostly women or people who like have a vulva or kind of identify that way.
Sure. Okay, great. That's really, really good to know. And I'm sure plenty of people will be keen to connect with you. I really encourage people to check out. I love your Instagram stuff. I love what you're posting on there and always enjoy following it. But yeah, this has been really, really fun. I've enjoyed finally getting to connect face to face, because I know we've chatted a bit on Instagram and stuff, but yeah, it's always a joy to kind of meet the person behind the text. So it's great.
Yeah, hopefully, thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, of course. Well, hopefully your dog is surviving and isn't just kind of scraping the door down. But yeah, thank you so much for getting up early and making the time. I really enjoyed chatting with you and getting to know you a bit more.
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you.
All right. Love you, Lauren. Catch you later, yeah?
Yeah. All right.
Bye.
Bye.
If you are deconstructing, there is no reason to do this alone. It can be an incredibly lonely process, but the deconstructionnetwork.com is a free resource to help you find others deconstructing in your local area. If you would like to support what I do, everything I do is for free, from talking to people for hours on end to producing resources and podcasts. It is only possible because people give generously. There's never any need to give. It will always be free, everything I do. But if you do, we do have an amazing private community group that we talk on over on Discord that you would gain access to. And we do regular audio and video chats on there as well. So it'd be great to see you in there. But of course, never any requirement. And of course, please, please, please come and talk to me on Instagram. I love connecting with people. I love helping people on their journey. If you need a safe space to process your deconstruction, I would love to connect. It's just at Phil Drysdale. Love every one of you. Peace.